Welcome to Convos from the Couch from Lifestance Health, where each episode you'll hear engaging and informative conversations with leading mental health professionals that will help guide you on your journey to leading a healthier, more fulfilling life. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Convos from the Couch by Lifestance Health. I'm Nikki Lienza, and on today's episode, I'll be talking with Aaron Munson, a clinician from one of our Lifestance Milwaukee offices, on the very important topic of OCD awareness. So welcome, Aaron. Great to have you on.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, is one of those topics that I think oftentimes people don't really understand. The general population, I would say, really maybe misunderstand really what it's about. It might be someone who says, "Oh, I like to keep my desk neat and clean and things in certain order," and they might even say, "Hey, that's me being very obsessive compulsive," when that might not be an actual accurate description of really what the disorder is. So the aim of today's episode is to really kind of get into more nuance of really truly what OCD is. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you for sure.
Me as well. Thank you.
As we jump in, why don't we start by you telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So Aaron Munson, I'm a licensed professional counselor. So LPC, right? There's all different kinds of degrees we can have, but I'm an LPC. And so I've been told I look kind of young, but I've been doing some kind of therapy for like 17 years or so.
Oh, wow. All right.
Right. And so I started with Rogers Behavioral Health out of college, and as I was getting my master's degree and got a lot of experience there. I was there for 7 years, and I went to private practice. I've been there for the last 10 plus years, and ultimately we have now been joined with Lifestance Health recently. So really been honing that practice with OCD and other OCD spectrum disorders, anxiety disorders, social anxiety, panic, you name it, when it comes to those last 17 or so years. Started with Rogers, like I said, where I got experience there, all with my grad school, and then have kind of really honed that craft and really worked with different people as well as other therapists to help myself, kind of make sure I'm staying on top of things in the last 10 plus years.
So it definitely sounds like you'll have lots of your own experience on obsessive compulsive disorder to share with our audience today.
Yep.
So as we jump in, let's kind of start off with what are some of the symptoms of OCD?
Great question. And I could go off on probably hours on all this stuff, but so to start with the basics of it, right? So OCD, as you said before, is obsessive compulsive disorder. And the obsessions are unwanted or intrusive thoughts, images, or impulses. And I'll get to compulsions in a second. We'll go over some examples, I think, later or whatnot. But it's important to have this distinction there because it can be thoughts. We often think of it as thoughts, things that bother us or worry us, the obsessional nature. There can be images that we have that really scare us or freak us out, or impulses to actually do things. I've had people who have impulses to run over a crosswalk and hit somebody in there. They would never do it, but that's kind of impulse that comes with that obsession. And of course, then that leads to they feel really freaked out and anxious and worried about it, and it happens all the time, and they're getting more and more intense, and that kind of builds on itself, which leads to compulsions, which are the act of either physical or mental behaviors that we do to try to alleviate that anxiety, to get rid of the thoughts, to make them better, so on and so forth. And so it's really important to distinguish those things. And kind of, we'll probably talk about this as well, but as you kind of said before, it's not just the simple things of having things ordered or keeping straight, but it's really that intrusive and impairing parts and impairing your life. Because I look at all disorders really, but especially any OCD as a spectrum, right? It's not you have it or you don't, right? It's somewhere in between. At some point, you and I as clinicians call things clinical or diagnose them.
Right.
But I've had some people who are a bit perfectionistic, or who like things kind of neat and orderly in their house, or just kind of like things a certain way. That's not necessarily OCD, and that becomes more on that spectrum of impairing, getting in your way of things, just kind of intrusive in your life.
Right. I like how you're clarifying, like specifically with obsessive compulsive disorder, that specific disorder can be very debilitating, and it can look like a lot of different things as well. Yep. So, but the important part of looking at it as a spectrum and kind of somewhere and falling out of that spectrum for sure. What are some of the different types of OCD?
Yeah, that could be a whole lecture itself too, right? But I guess what I'll highlight is you got your classics that you see on TV and social media or in Hollywood and that kind of stuff of your contamination or kind of germ kind of OCD, hand washing, those kind of things. You're just keeping things straight and orderly, but we want to kind of, those are definitely all different kinds, but I think there's a common misconception that those are the most common. They're really not. In fact,
Right.
all of them are probably equally common, to be quite honest with you. And I wanted to highlight some of the other ones. There's like religious OCD, where you're afraid of offending God, whether you are or aren't religious, that happens. People who tend to be more religious tend to have religious OCD more, but it can happen to anybody. Something called scrupulosity, which involves religion, but also involves trying to be, feel like you have to be a really good person, those kind of things, making bad mistakes, which also brings in perfectionism. As you can see, they all kind of touch each other. They're not
Yeah.
one off, right? They all touch each other. Things like sexual intrusive images or impulses, OCD,
Yeah.
harming, right? And like, we have to as a clinician, you have to make sure you distinguish between who actually want to harm somebody or themselves, like
Right.
with suicidal thoughts or cutting. But there's a lot of people who are so deathly afraid of it that they will not go near a knife. They won't touch a knife, right? And so there are all different kinds of OCD that you wouldn't even think of, and probably some I'm missing because I've heard of some unique ones over the years where it just
Right.
basically is that part of your brain getting obsessed about something that probably is unlikely.
There's just so much nuance to it as you're giving some of the examples of some of the types. One example, this wasn't from one of my own clients, but just another example I've heard of. You mentioned the harm
Hmm.
OCD of actually this particular example I'm going to give of someone driving and they have this intrusive thought that they hit someone. And
Yep.
so as they're driving, they're constantly looking around like, did I hit someone? And it's that
Yep.
intrusive thought of you hit someone. And so they'll look for clues, which is maybe as we get into looking at the compulsive behaviors of what they're
Yep.
doing to kind of bring down that anxiety of like, well, if I would have hit someone, then I would have heard some sort of noise from the
Yep.
car or something. But even as they try to reason with it, with the OCD, it doesn't often like lessen the OCD. And that's what I think makes treating it so hard. Go ahead. Go
Exactly,
ahead.
because we talk about. I always give this example to my patients. My wife, back when we were younger and in grad school, and she was in grad school down. I lived out in, about half an hour away from her grad school, basically, right? And where we both lived, and she was driving down there and got in a car accident. It wasn't, no one was hurt, but the car accident was kind of bad, but everyone was thankfully safe. And she called me and I was out and she can you come meet me. And of course, she was kind of crying, hysterical, all normal stuff for car accident. Go down there. What's the first thing I do is I console her and say it's gonna be all right and check in on her, that kind of stuff. I give her reassurance, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
normal. In situations where it's normal to give reassurance and to comfort someone or ourselves, that's normal. What OC does, it wants that reassurance and comfort for things that they don't need it for. And we can kind of
Yeah.
go into those more examples later, but that's kind of the idea is it's normal for us as family members, loved ones, parents, whoever it
Right.
is, to give that reassurance to loved ones, kids, whoever it is, but it actually feels that fire more so because of how the OCD works.
Right, right. And I like how you said it fuels the fire because of how OCD works, which a little bit later on we'll talk about a very specific perspective, evidence-based method of how you help with it. Because the
Right.
natural idea is that you want to reassure
Yep.
yourself of it. So tell us a little bit more about other maybe examples of obsessional thoughts, or even if you want to say intrusive thoughts.
Yeah. And we call them obsessional intrusive. They're kind of one and the same, frankly.
Got you.
I mean, so it could be anything, right? You use the
Yeah.
example of, uh,
Hitting
I use the
someone.
example of someone, what was that?
Oh, you were saying I was using the example of someone thinking that they hit someone,
Yep.
but go ahead. What
It's
one were you gonna give
there's
there?
it's a great example. We can make call driving obsessions or driving
Yeah,
OCD, right? It's a one off of harm, right? You feel like you harm somebody, so that
right,
happens quite a bit. Driving, obsessions about did I hit somebody? And remember, these are the thoughts or impulses or images. The compulsions come later. But it could be any kind of thought that sense. Harming someone else or themselves. I've had even people I know personally, not just even patients, who worry about harming somebody, right? Don't want to be around a knife for those reasons. It's also not uncommon to worry about harming your kids, especially this has happened so much that not every single mother who has postpartum has
right,
OCD, but it's
right,
very not uncommon for them to have no thoughts about harming their child. And then after all they go through in the birthing process, all the
right.
hormone stuff, it kicks up and then they have these thoughts of
Yeah,
harming their child. We all as parents tend to worry about, are we doing the best for our kids? But this goes above and beyond that, this intrusive image stuff or impulses. Sexual of nature to themselves, to
yeah,
other people, to random people. Of
right,
course, your classics like germs and OCD. COVID's been a big one. It's
yeah,
influenced people quite a bit. I could go on and on, but there's all different
Right,
kinds.
right.
Perfectionism, that
Yeah,
kind of gets in the muddy the areas of what kind of anxiety disorder, quote unquote, it is. But really, perfectionism, which isn't bad in of itself, and that becomes intrusive and impulsive, is someone who's constantly worrying about their grades, are they doing the best thing, or in their job, those kind of things.
right, right. I even looking at other obsessional or intrusive thoughts of like, well, actually, as I'm sitting here thinking that, where that floats us into more like compulsive behaviors, which is looking at rituals and stuff. Which actually, why don't we just talk about that? What are some examples of like compulsive behavior related to OCD?
Yeah. And so you kind of back to that reference you point out about the personal driving obsession. So the obsession is the initial thought that you have, image or impulse, right? Same thing. Initial thought, which you can't always control. Even the random people, I give an example. My niece, my niece is 11 years old now. If she ever hears this, she's gonna hate it. But there's a time when she was the first of all the kids that we have, the cousins and my kids and stuff, and loved her death. She was cute, 1 year old. I had some images of kicking her down. I have no
Yeah.
idea desire to do that, right?
Right.
That's
Got
not within
you.
my nature,
Got you.
right?
Right.
But it's that
Right.
initial thought that kind of pops in her head. Most
Yeah.
of us without OCD can be like, well, that was weird. I don't want to do that. I'm gonna let it
Maybe
go.
just dismiss it a bit.
Miss it,
Yeah.
right? Whatever. Someone with OCD, though, by nature of how their brain works, it's hard for them just to let it go, right? Quote unquote. And so that initial thought pops up, image or impulse, and then it turns into, I get rid of this thought. I don't like it. I don't like how it makes you feel. And enter in the compulsion. We also call them rituals or safety
Rituals. Yes.
behaviors.
Yes.
I like safety behaviors a lot because you're trying to keep yourself safe for something
Yeah.
that's an
Yeah.
imagined, fear or imagined scary thing. And so let's say go back to the classic of hand washing. So I'll wash my hands again and again and again. Well, initially we all wash our hands a little bit, but if I keep doing it again and again and again because of these feared thoughts and worries, it never quite satisfies enough because as we said earlier, you're not really trying to fix anything. The OCD makes you think you are, but you're really not. And therefore the compulsion then or behavior just kind of adds on itself. For example, of you said with the driving, they'll check things. I've had people who drive back and re-go back things. People
Hmm.
avoid quite a bit, especially if they're on harming or sexual thoughts. They've had thoughts about harming kids, and so they'll
Yeah.
avoid kids at all costs, right? They won't
Right.
change their own kids' diapers. I've had so
Right.
many different compulsions that you name it. Your other classics of hand washing, of using hands as barriers to things, keeping things ordered and arranged and having to make things perfect in your house. Rereading things if you're into
Yeah.
perfectionism, it could go on and on.
Right. And I think that's the key here is like we could go on and on with this, which also makes me think of how many people out there who might struggle with some of these symptoms that don't even realize, like, holy crap, I did not know this was OCD. I'm having these intrusive thoughts of like a knife and maybe stabbing myself or stabbing someone else. I didn't know
Yeah.
that was OCD there. So I think again, this is why we're talking about this for sure.
Right, and I appreciate that. Again, that's the thing is some people see these things as just things they do, right? I just do this stuff, right? And
Right.
again, do we all have superstitions? Do I wear the same Packers jersey when I'm watching my team? Sure, yes. I mean, those are different things than actually getting away in your life. Again, because compulsions, just like obsessions, should be intrusive in your life, right? So if you're doing these things, it's at least causing enough distress and impairment in your life. You're like, I don't like this. So even if you do the same thing the same way every day, that can be routine, but if it gets in your way of your life, and I also wanted to highlight too, because you kind of made a reference there. It is
Mhm.
these physical compulsions or safety behaviors, but also mental, and that's where people may not always see them. Well, I
Right.
just do this. I just worry about stuff, or I just kind of try to plan out my entire day, which again is not indicative of OCD of
Right.
itself. But
Right.
if it gets in
Right.
the way of your life, and so impairing, if you talk to a therapist like yourself or myself, start
Right.
realizing, yeah, you're doing a lot of mental kind of these behaviors or
Yeah.
compulsions that probably aren't really necessary, and that's
Right.
because it wants to alleviate some kind of worry or obsession.
Right. And so I'm glad you brought up the mental compulsions because if we're going to use the example of just washing hands, so the obsessive thought of contamination, my hands are dirty, the compulsion would be, let me go wash my hands. So then it alleviates a little bit of the obsessive thought until it gets clicked again where you have to do it. But so what that compulsive, we're talking about a physical compulsion or something actively you can do. A mental compulsion is something at a whole another level, which I actually think in treating OCD is often a little bit more difficult because with a compulsion of that you can physically do, you also have a very specific treatment format that you can also maybe try to help you refrain from that and sit with anxiety. But with the mental compulsions, I find those are just so much more difficult. But,
Yeah.
before we continue maybe to talk more about mental compulsions, let's talk about maybe a very specific therapeutic format that is often one of the most evidence-based
Yep.
ways to help with OCD, which is exposure response prevention. So can you tell us a little
Yep.
bit more about what that is and some examples of it?
Sure, definitely. So ERP, or exposure and response prevention, is a kind of CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, specifically behavioral, because it helps to show the idea of habituation, which is the more we do something, the more we get used to it. And so I'll sidetrack for a second, because I honestly think that ERP is also called exposure therapy for short. I honestly think a lot of our life is exposure. If you think about it, right? You're a 1 year old trying to learn to crawl and walk. Now we don't think of it because we're one, we don't know that, but we're nervous to stand up and walk and go, and we fall and stuff. So we're kind of exposing ourselves to something that causes us this anxiety and uncertainty. Learn to ride a bike, learn to drive a car, go on your first date, all those classic things we think of just normal life events, which they are also in themselves exposures, because you're actually facing something that makes you feel uncomfortable. Even if it's also cool, like if I get to learn to drive this car, I can go anywhere I want to. But
Right.
initially, it still makes you feel uncomfortable and nervous and uncertain. And so really that's the basis of what exposure therapy is you practice those things. The more dates you go on, the more times you ride your bike, you walk, or you drive your car, eventually you get to like, oh, this is easy. You habituate to it. And so life we do that with, but when it comes to OCD or other intrusive anxiety stuff that we experience, we tell ourselves, or others tell us, well, just avoid it, forget about it. But actually it's the best thing to expose yourself to it when hopefully it's actually not real danger. I'm never going to put somebody in actual dangerous situations. Let's just say, for instance, they're not going to hit someone with the car. They're driving, and the goal is, if they don't want to drive, they want to, because they don't want anything to happen to them. So the goal is, I want you to try driving for a block or two, or around the block, whatever, and see what happens. They're going to have these urges to go back and recheck, or to look, whatever it is, and that's that ritual type stuff or
Right.
response. And so our goal is expose yourself, the E of the ERP. Don't do those behaviors of the checking or going back and going forth, or whatever your compulsion is. And then the idea is, the more times you do that, and then we kind of taper it up with different example situations, you realize, just like you did with the stuff early in your life, didn't realize your exposures, you realize, oh, nothing bad's happening. And
Right.
therefore the obsession then starts to quiet down over time.
Those are great examples. Oftentimes when I'm working with clients and trying to use ERP with them as well, I'll use the example of how we habituate. For example, if we're around someone who we can tell is wearing a lot of cologne or
Hmm.
perfume, and it's like, it smells like so much and so strong, and you wonder, how can they not smell it so strong for
Yep.
themselves? Well, we might put on cologne and not be able to smell it as much. So we put on more until we can smell it. It's because we habituate to the smell.
Exactly.
It's a similar idea behind exposures as well.
Yep.
The idea is exposing ourselves to it to habituate to it, so the response to it isn't as intense.
Exactly, right. Whether that's a physical thing like smelling something, or like
Right.
I mentioned before, when we're learning to ride a bike, or just
Right.
anything in life, the more that we do something, the more we practice at it. I take sports, the more you practice it, the more you hopefully get better at it, get used to it. It's just that these things are scarier because they're seen as, you know, weird or odd or just intrusive, and so they don't want to face them, they'd rather avoid them.
Right. Now, I know that we had a conversation previous to our
Mhm.
recording today of, I was sharing with you my perspective of ERP. It's not always very warm and fuzzy, meaning, when I'm working with my clients, my goal is, especially if I'm just working with just general anxiety and things that might be stressing them out, is to help them contain that anxiety, and teaching them coping skills to help kind of contain
Correct.
that and stuff like that. But that's not what we're talking about with ERP. And can you
Right.
tell us a little bit more from that point of view?
Sure. And it's not fun, right? So I always reference
Right,
that when I tell people. And I referenced
right.
this one time. I remember I was working at Rogers years ago, and I had this one client who was really challenging herself really hard, and it was hard for her. She'd been doing it for weeks, and it was hard. And that's where she'd come to a program where I'd see her daily. At one point, I was smiling, and I'll tell you why in a second. She's like, "Why are you smiling? This is causing me so much kind of anxiety and grief. I don't like it." And I said, "I'm smiling because I know you're making progress, and you're facing these fears that are really hard for you. So it might seem like we're like enjoying in this stuff, like we're pushing you too hard. That's
Yeah,
because we know that's going to help in the long run. And it is hard work. I always say to people,
yeah,
I say, you've got to be ready for it. And I truly
right,
mean that. Like, you come to my office after the first few sessions and you're like, I don't know if I'm ready. And I'm like, well, let's get to the point where you can be ready, because it is truly hard work, and it's not warm or fuzzy. It's tough stuff.
yeah, I agree for sure.
Yeah.
Any other takeaways you'd like to share about obsessive compulsive disorder?
So I guess, I mean, we could go on, like I said, for hours, and
Right.
anyone's welcome to contact me or anybody else who, is specialized in to get more information if they want to, just to hear about it,
Right.
whether you suffer with OCD or not. The thing I would just say, often people, and this probably applies to a lot of mental health disorders, but OCD in particular, they think they're weird or abnormal, no one else
Yeah.
has this. A lot of research studies that I've seen over the years range from anywhere from 3.5 to 5% of the population has OCD, which that's just the reported cases, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's like millions of people.
That
We're talking about those who
is.
have it, right?
Right. Right.
And so I think it's important to know that you're not alone. You're not weird and crazy.
Right.
Majority of people that I work with are normal, everyday people that you would
Yes.
see anywhere else,
Right.
teachers, whoever it is. And
Right.
it's just that they're inside their head. I have a guy right now I'm talking to who's he's a prominent business person, right? And so the idea is like they're very functional. It's just that this
Yeah.
stuff keeps them from doing things.
Yeah.
Some people aren't functional, and that's OCD can be very intense and severe.
Right.
Most
Right.
people are, and it's just they think that they're weird when they're really not.
Right,
You
right.
know?
So I love the fact that you just help people realize that you're not alone. There are so many more millions of people that also struggle with this. I would say OCD can be a beast. And if you're able to function with it, great. And I know there's a lot of people who can't, and that's okay too, because hopefully you're getting help and you're working very hard at trying to help yourself with it for sure. So
Yep.
thank you so much, Aaron.
You're
This
welcome.
was really informative. And I do hope we reach a
Yeah,
lot of people who are like, my gosh, I didn't realize I was really struggling with OCD. So
me
thank
too.
you again.
You're welcome.
Appreciate
Thank you.
you.